Crying little puppy runs to police officer. His collar leaves the him in shock. Officer David Morales had navigated countless emergencies in Riverside County fires roaring through back streets, midnight pursuits along the freeway, and public gatherings teetering on chaos. None of those moments, however, prepared him for the morning he stepped into a rain-swept street and locked eyes with a trembling, tearful puppy. Traffic hummed by, headlights reflecting on flooded asphalt, as the pup sprinted toward him with sheer desperation. David's heart pounded with unexpected intensity. He scooped the soaked little creature into his arms, instantly soothed by the dog's frantic warmth. But when David read the strange inscription on its collar, he froze, shaken by a name that felt like a ghost from his past. The torrential rain hammered Riverside County from dawn until well past midday. Water gushed from clogged gutters, streetlights shimmered in mist, and thick clouds pressed down over Maple Avenue. Officer David Morales had just responded to a small break-in call at the far end of the street. Standing under the grey sky, he was about to climb back into his patrol cruiser when movement drew his attention, something small and desperate scurrying near the curb. At first, David thought it might be a stray cat. Then he saw the clumsy little body slip across a puddle, squealing in alarm. A puppy. Without hesitation, he hopped over a shallow torrent and signaled approaching drivers to slow. The pup stumbled across the flooded road, battered by rain and half blinded by headlights. Its thin cry ricocheted in David's chest. He crouched, arms extended in a universal sign of welcome. Time seemed to slow in that moment. The downpour hammered David's shoulders and soaked through his uniform, but all he could focus on was the dog's terrified whimper. Then the pup darted forward, muddy paws sliding, and crashed into his arms. David nearly fell backward with the sudden impact, but managed to steady them both. The wet fur pressed to his chest, tiny ribs shaking. It was like holding a heart that trembled in his hands. He tucked the pup beneath his raincoat and sprinted to the cruiser. Inside, he cranks the heater, pulling off his own jacket to drape the shivering dog. Drops of water pelted the windows, but David felt oddly calm. The dog's eyes were huge, dark, and trusting in a way that tugged at him unexpectedly. His gaze shifted to a battered leather collar. With gentle fingers, he brushed aside a flap of wet fur to read the faint words embossed along the surface. Lucas, never be afraid to come home. David's chest tightened. Lucas. He whispered the name, remembering an old friend who once died far too young. The dog whined and pawed at his forearm, bringing him back to the present. Could this be a bizarre coincidence, or was fate tapping on his shoulder? Immediately, David knew the pup needed warmth and medical attention. He picked up the radio and reported finding a stray animal in the storm, then drove to Riverside Veterinary, a 24-hour clinic he passed on his regular patrol route. As thunder rolled overhead, he parked outside the clinic's door and rushed the puppy inside. A veterinarian named Dr. Wells hurried over, leading him to an exam room. In the bright overhead lights, David saw how scrawny and soaked the dog really was, ribs visible beneath patchy fur. Doctor Wells examined the pup. No major injuries, though the dog was clearly underfed and had minor scratches on its paws. "It's a miracle he survived out there," she said, carefully drying him with a towel. David exhaled, letting the tension seep out. He was grateful the puppy's condition wasn't worse. "He's young, right?" David asked, stroking the dog's damp head. 3 or 4 months, I'd guess," replied Dr. Wells, preparing a mild sedative. "No microchip. Probably a stray. You did the right thing bringing him in." As the dog received basic care antibiotic ointment, a quick vaccine, David leaned against the wall, eyes drifting to the collar on the exam table. The embossed name and words glistened under fluorescent light. He felt an odd resonance deep in his chest. Years ago he knew a Lucas who was gone too soon. Now, here was a battered collar carrying that name and a cryptic motto about home. Need to fill out a quick intake form, Dr. Wells said. We'll keep him overnight if you want, or if no one claims him, I can transfer him to the county shelter. Yet something in David balked at leaving the dog to an uncertain fate in a crowded system. He didn't fully grasp why, only that the name on the collar and the pleading look in those big eyes weighed on him. I might keep him for a while, he said, running a hand over his rain-soaked hair. At least until I figure out who owns him or where he came from. Dr. Wells nodded, handing David a few pamphlets on caring for malnourished pups. After some paperwork, David tucked the sleeping dog into his arms once more and returned to the cruiser. The worst of the storm had passed, but Maple Avenue was still littered with debris and swirling water. Driving slowly back to his small house, David couldn't shake the sense that he'd just entered a riddle he hadn't realized he was meant to solve. Once home, he set the pup still dozing under the sedative on a soft towel in the living room. The name Lucas hovered in David's mind like a candle in a dark room. He touched the collar again, feeling a nudge of old grief. Could this be more than a random twist of fate? Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. David sighed, closing his eyes. He had no idea how deeply this chance encounter was about to transform his life. Morning brought a cool hush, the storm clouds drifting away to reveal a damp neighborhood glinting under timid sunlight. David Morales awoke on the living room couch, stiff-necked and disoriented. His first thought was the puppy. He bolted upright and spotted the little dog still curled on a towel, nose tucked beneath its tail. Relief washed over him as the puppy blinked awake and slowly stood, tail giving a tentative wag. David scooped him up. The pup licked his chin, a timid, grateful motion that made David laugh. "Looks like we're stuck with each other, little guy," he said softly. He realized he had to leave for his shift soon. His pulse kicked with the realization that he'd never arranged for pet care in his single-man household. Hastily, he sorted an old crate from the garage, lined it with blankets, and set a small bowl of water and a bit of puppy food purchased earlier that morning at a nearby store. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do for a few hours. Before he left, David knelt to check the collar again. Lucas, never be afraid to come home. The letters were faint, clearly worn by time. No phone number or address. He gently tested the buckle, which seemed intact despite scratches. If the pup had an owner, they cared enough to engrave that message. Then again, maybe it was second-hand, passed from one dog to another. The question nagged him as he locked up his home and headed to the station. Riverside County Police Headquarters bustled with the usual Monday energy dispatchers juggling calls, officers grabbing coffee, the phone ringing off the hook. As David slipped into the briefing room, his partner Elaine Hunter greeted him with a teasing grin. "Morning, Morales. Hear you rescued a little dog in the storm. Word traveled fast." David shrugged, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Yeah, found him drenched on Maple. Taking care of him for now." Elaine's eyebrows lifted. "Good luck. Let me know if you need dog-sitting." "I love puppies, though my cats might protest." He chuckled, nodding politely. Yet beneath the camaraderie, he felt an odd swirl of emotions. Should he file an official found dog report? Probably. After briefing, he did so, typing male puppy, approximately 3-4 months old, found wearing a leather collar with unusual inscription. He also posted a photo on the precinct's internal bulletin board, hoping someone might recognize the dog. No immediate hits. All day, David's mind wandered back to the dog he'd left crated at home. Usually, he prided himself on being methodical and thorough on or off duty. But having a pet, even temporarily, was uncharted territory. Stray calls, traffic stops, and stolen property reports blurred together. He found himself counting down the hours until he could return home. When he finally did, the puppy yapped with delight, front paws scrabbling at the crate door. David scooped him up, letting the dog's joyful squirms ease the stress of the day. A thorough cleanup was required. Apparently, the pup had an accident in the crate, but David approached it with unexpected patience. He recognized a flicker of fatherly protectiveness that both surprised and amused him. After dinner, microwaved leftovers for David, proper puppy food for the dog. He sat at the kitchen table, rummaging online. A local social media group called Riverside Lost and Found Pets might be the place to check. He composed a short post. Found young puppy near Maple Avenue last night. Wearing a collar that says, "Lucas, never be afraid to come home. Please contact me if you have any info." Within minutes, the post gained likes and well wishes, but no solid leads. A wave of disappointment hit him. He glanced at the dog, who gnawed a squeaky toy contently. He studied the battered collar in the lamp's glow, noticing faint scuffs that might once have been another inscription. Impossible to read now. What was it about that name and phrase that clung to David's mind? He recalled an old friend named Lucas, a high school buddy who died in a car accident a decade ago. The memory twisted something in David's gut. Probably just a coincidence, he muttered, yet couldn't fully convince himself. He recognized the tug of unresolved grief and the faint hope that maybe, in caring for this dog, he'd find a missing piece of closure. The puppy padded over, toy still in his mouth, tilting his head as if to ask why David looked so solemn. Deciding the dog needed a name, something more personal than, "Hey, buddy," David mused on calling him Pup for the time being. It might not be permanent, but it was a start. Pup wiggled happily at the attention, oblivious to the deeper questions swirling in his new caretaker's mind. For the next few nights, David balanced work with puppy duties. On breaks, he scrolled pet adoption sites, scouring for a listing that matched Pup's description. Nothing. He also wrestled with the question, if Pup's owner never turned up, was David ready to keep him? The small house had always been quiet, just how David liked it until now. Yet each evening, Pup's wagging tail and insistent licks dissolved David's hesitations. The nights no longer felt so lonely, and the shadows from his own regrets no longer stretched as far. Taking Pup outside, David gazed up at the stars, feeling an improbable calm. Though the words on the collar remained a riddle, Pup's presence felt like an answer to something he didn't yet know how to ask. Late on a Thursday evening, David found himself scrolling the Riverside Lost and Found Pets group again. Pup curled at his feet. The night was quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Lantern-like streetlights cast faint amber pools across the lawn outside. A new comment appeared beneath David's post. A user named Hector R. wrote, "There's a rumor about stray dogs wearing custom collars found in random spots. My cousin saw one named Lucas too, but on a black lab. Might be a group giving them out to encourage adoption." David's pulse quickened. Another dog wearing Lucas on its collar. He messaged Hector privately, who explained that his cousin encountered a black lab in a vacant lot, also wearing a collar with the words, "Lucas, never be afraid to come home." The dog vanished before they could catch it, so Pup wasn't the only dog bearing that particular message. David stared at his screen in disbelief. Was there an underground network placing these collars on strays? If so, why Lucas? He typed back, "That's exactly the inscription on my Pup's collar. Any idea who's behind this?" Hector replied that he only knew rumors some whispered about a nomadic rescuer named Nate or Nathan, who traveled from town to town distributing these collars. Others said it was a volunteer group trying to give strays a better chance of being rescued. No firm details, though. Intrigued, David felt a jolt of determination. Pup's arrival might be part of a bigger story. Maybe if he discovered the source of these collars, he could learn Pup's past. Or, at the very least, understand the significance of Lucas. He decided to investigate more actively. Though he had to tread lightly, this wasn't an official police case. The next morning, David visited the Riverside County Animal Shelter before work. He chatted with the front desk staff, describing Pup's collar and the rumor of multiple dogs labeled Lucas. They shook their heads, having no official record of such a phenomenon. One volunteer mentioned hearing about collar messages, but never encountered them firsthand. David left feeling stymied, but not defeated. Pup's story was out there, entangled in the experiences of other strays. The connection to Lucas lingered in his mind, stirring old memories he'd tried to bury. He recalled the final conversation he had with his friend Lucas in high school, an argument over something trivial that ended badly. Days later, Lucas was gone forever. That afternoon, David's partner Elaine teased him at the station, asking if he'd adopted the puppy for good. "He's basically your kid now," she joked. "Next thing you'll be shopping for dog sweaters." David forced a grin. "We'll see. He's sure grown on me." He left out the swirl of questions crowding his mind. Did Pup truly belong with him, or was there someone else who might reclaim him? Later that night, after another fruitless search on social media, David felt Pup snuggle against his leg on the couch. The dog had that trusting, half-lidded gaze that said, "I'm safe with you." David set down his laptop, stroked Pup's ears, and stared at the battered collar. "Lucas, never be afraid to come home." The words looked older each day, as if the collar had traveled a hard road. He wondered if Nate was real. If so, how had Pup ended up wandering Maple Avenue during a fierce storm? Maybe Nate or his group had left Pup in a public place, hoping a good Samaritan would rescue him. If that was the plan, it succeeded. But David wanted to know more. Something about Pup's battered, sweet presence chipped away at the officer's usual detachment, leaving him craving answers with an intensity that surprised him. Sleep eluded David that night. He lay awake, hearing the quiet hum of the refrigerator and Pup's soft snores. He pictured a traveling rescuer forging collars with that same inscription, scattering them across the county. It sounded almost mythic. "Never be afraid to come home." The words rang both comforting and haunting. In a moment of restlessness, he picked up Pup's collar from the coffee table and traced his fingers over the name Lucas. Memories spilled back his friend's bright grin, the shared jokes at lunch, the time Lucas gave his coat to a stray dog on a winter day. If his friend was still alive, he'd have loved Pup. Maybe he'd have done exactly this, dedicate random collars to champion second chances. David closed his eyes, letting the swirl of sorrow and wonder roll over him. Tomorrow, he'd keep digging. He refused to believe Pup's story would remain a mystery forever. If the collar's origin was out there, he'd find it. As Pup shifted, pressing a warm muzzle against David's arm, the officer felt the first flicker of peace. In the midst of old regrets, an assurance that searching for the truth was worth every sleepless hour. A few days later, Hector messaged David with a possible lead. A small group of Good Samaritans occasionally placed bowls of food for stray dogs at an abandoned rail yard on the outskirts of Riverside County. Hector's cousin claimed to have spotted multiple dogs wearing unique collars there. David's heart thudded. This might be the best chance yet to find someone connected to Pup's collar. On his next day off, David loaded Pup into his car, driving toward the old rail yard. Once a busy transport hub, it was now a collection of rusting boxcars, twisted tracks, and chain-link fences that sagged in disrepair. Weeds choked the gravel, and graffiti covered the train cars in neon bursts of color. Parking near a broken gate, David clipped Pup's leash, and they ventured into the maze of abandoned rails. Overhead, the midday sun blazed, intensifying the quiet. Every so often, Pup sniffed at scraps or pawed curiously at old crates. Something about the rail yard felt hauntingly still, as if it remembered its glory days and now existed in limbo. David spotted footprints in dusty patches, some human, some dog. Empty water bowls sat near a rotting wooden pallet. Pup sniffed them, then gazed up, tail wagging uncertainly as if to say, "They were here, but they're gone now. A sudden rustle made David glance behind a rusted rail car. He caught a glimpse of movement, someone ducking out of sight. Heart pounding, David approached slowly, Pup at his side. "Hello," he called. "I'm not here to cause trouble." At first, there was silence. Then a hesitant voice responded, "What do you want?" David circled the railcar, finding a woman in her 40s crouched near a makeshift crate of dog supplies, cans of food, leashes, old towels. Her expression flickered between caution and defiance. "We don't need the police chasing us away. We're just feeding strays nobody else wants." David held up a hand. "I'm not shutting this down. I'm searching for information about a specific collar. My name's David Morales, and this puppy," he gestured to Pup, "was found wearing one that says, 'Lucas, never be afraid to come home.' You heard of that?" She studied Pup, then exhaled. "I've seen a few dogs with that inscription. Thought it was someone's idea of a rescue message. The strays come and go. So do the collars. We pass them around if a dog's collar breaks." They end up with the same phrase sometimes. David's mind reeled. So it's more than one collar. "I heard about a man named Nate or Nathan who might distribute them." The woman's gaze softened. "Yeah, I've met him. Nate Roswell. He travels, carrying a stack of homemade collars. Each says something about Lucas, about not being scared of going home. The details are fuzzy. We never pried too hard. He just shows up, drops off supplies, sometimes leaves a dog or two. He can't shelter himself. Then he's gone." "So, you don't know where he is now?" David asked. She shook her head. "Not sure. Last I heard, he was heading north, maybe near Redwood Lake. He mentioned building an informal network of people who help strays. I only know bits and pieces. Sorry." Despite the disappointment, David offered a grateful nod. "Thank you. That's more than I had." They chatted briefly about Pup, who wagged his tail and sniffed around the crates. The woman, who introduced herself as Marnie, admired Pup's bright eyes. She told David a bit about their railyard group, a patchwork of volunteers who felt official shelters were overloaded. They fed and sometimes rehomed dogs directly. Before leaving, David handed her his card. "If Nate shows up, or if you hear more, please call me." Marnie tucked the card in her pocket, giving Pup one last pat. "That pup looks happy with you. Maybe that's the point, you know. That collar of his led him to a real home." Her voice held a gentle undercurrent of understanding. David swallowed, glancing at Pup. Maybe so. He walked back to his car, Pup bounding at his heels. His mind buzzed with possibilities. Nate Roswell, someone who might have answers about Lucas and the meaning behind these collars, was drifting from place to place, forging new rescue lines. Redwood Lake. That was at least an hour away, near farmland and hiking trails. David considered going out there on his next free weekend. Something told him Pup's story was entwined with Nate's, and he couldn't rest until he understood how. As he drove away from the railyard's rust and weeds, the battered collar glinted in the passenger seat. Pup rested his head on David's lap, as though sensing his mixed emotions. David stroked Pup's ears, reminding himself that each clue brought him closer to the truth. The day's bright sun gave way to twilight, the sky dusted with reds and purples. David felt the subtle shift inside him, the slow unraveling of heartbreak and the stirring of renewed purpose. The following weekend, David rose early and loaded Pup into the car once more, determined to chase down rumors about Redwood Lake. Highway 17 stretched north, flanked by rolling hills and oak groves. Pup perched on the passenger seat, peering at the scenery as though it were an endless spectacle. By mid-morning, they arrived at Redwood Lake Nature Preserve, a sprawling landscape of conifer forests, winding trails, and shimmering water. The main visitors center bustled with families, hikers, and volunteers. David parked in the gravel lot and clipped Pup's leash, scanning for any sign of a traveling rescuer or an informal dog network. He spoke with a ranger named Zora at the information desk, looking for a man named Nate Roswell. He might have volunteered here recently, helping animals or strays. Zora furrowed her brow. We did have a Nathan Ara sign up to help maintain trails, but he left a few days ago. Didn't leave forwarding info. Sorry. Disappointment flared. David exhaled. Anyone around who spoke to him more? She tapped her chin. He mostly kept to himself, seemed kind, talked about rescuing dogs. He told me about customizing collars for animals he found. I remember he mentioned losing someone important named Lucas. But that's all. David felt his heart twinge. Losing someone important named Lucas. He forced a nod. That helps. Thank you. Outside, Pup trotted by David's side as they explored the preserve, hoping to stumble upon any lingering clues. People recognized Pup's sweetness, but no one recognized the collar. Eventually, David and Pup meandered along a trail by the lake's edge. The water sparkled under midday sun, a tranquil respite from David's swirling thoughts. He paused by a stand of pine trees. Pup sniffed the grass, then gazed at him expectantly. David thought about the heartbreak behind the words on Pup's collar, the heartbreak behind Nate's rumored quest. Perhaps Lucas was Nate's friend, brother, or beloved family member. So many dogs, each wearing a piece of a broken story. David recalled his own friend Lucas from long ago, how they parted with unresolved tensions. Maybe that parallel explained why David felt so driven, like he was righting a cosmic wrong. Letting Pup rest in the shade, David fished out a notepad to jot down new leads. Redwood Lake turned up empty, so maybe Nate had moved on again. He could try contacting small vets or shelters further north, but was it worth chasing a ghost? Pup seemed healthy, content, yet David recognized a deeper longing for answers. He craved closure for Pup, and maybe for himself. By late afternoon, they returned to the visitors' center. A volunteer behind a small kiosk recognized Pup's collar. "I saw a dog with that exact inscription a month ago," she exclaimed. He was a black lab. Folks said the caretaker had lost someone named Lucas, so he put that phrase on multiple collars. David's pulse jumped. So it's a pattern. People keep telling me it's about one man's grief. She nodded gently. It might be, but it's become bigger, passing from dog to dog, town to town. A way for these animals to find homes, maybe. David thanked her, feeling a swirl of admiration and sorrow. This ephemeral figure, Nate Roswell, was spreading a piece of personal heartbreak as a lifeline for stray dogs. The parallels to David's own regrets about his friend Lucas were impossible to ignore. Maybe the message was for any soul who felt lost or alone. Never be afraid to come home. Driving back as dusk fell, David glanced at Pup in the rearview mirror. The dog had grown significantly, eyes bright with curiosity. Every day, Pup acted more like family. David realized he wanted to keep Pup permanently, no matter what. Yet the puzzle of the collar remained like an unfinished story he couldn't abandon. He felt certain that, somehow, Pup's presence was helping him come to terms with his old friend's memory. Maybe, in a sense, Pup was leading him home too. Officer Morales soon found his daily routine consumed by official work. A spree of break-ins rattled Riverside County, demanding long hours. Pup spent time at a trusted neighbor's house or dozing in David's small backyard. Even so, at night, David pored over online boards or called small vet clinics, searching for any lead on Nate Roswell's next stop. Silence. One evening, Elaine cornered him in the station hallway. "You look exhausted, Dave. You good?" He forced a half smile. "Yeah, just busy, and Pup's keeping me on my toes." She crossed her arms, scanning his face, still chasing that collar story. David sighed. A bit. Heard Nate might be near the desert communities next, but it's a long shot. I still feel this need to know why the collar says Lucas. Elaine nodded sympathetically, then lowered her voice. Look, we all have regrets, but maybe you're tying your old friend's memory too tightly to this. You rescued. Pup, gave him a home that's a happy ending already. Her words lingered in David's mind. Maybe he was projecting. Yet, the collar had awakened a stirring of guilt and longing. He remembered the final argument with his friend Lucas, how he never apologized, never made amends. The sorrow of that unfinished chapter haunted him still. Later that night, Pup curled at David's feet while he sifted through an old box of keepsakes. Photographs, ticket stubs, souvenirs from high school. Then he found a worn envelope marked with his friend's name, Lucas Harrington. Inside were notes they'd swapped in class, pictures from a soccer tournament, even a draft of a letter Lucas never sent. David had never dared read it thoroughly. Now he took a breath and opened it. In the letter, Lucas mentioned wanting to start a dog rescue someday. We all need a place we can come back to, Lucas wrote. A home that doesn't judge us. Animals remind us of that simple, unconditional love. Tears blurred David's vision. The parallels to Pup's collar stung fiercely. It was as though two different Lucases shared the same dream, one from David's past, another from Nate Roswell's. He pressed a palm to his forehead. Pup stirred, resting his chin on David's lap as if sensing his distress. David set the letter aside and gently ran a hand along Pup's collar. We've got our own rescue mission now, he whispered. I couldn't save my friend, but maybe I can honor him. The next day, David used a chunk of personal time to do something he'd postponed for years. He visited Lucas Harrington's grave. Pup trotted beside him through rows of headstones until they stopped at a modest marker. Standing there, reading the name of his old friend, David felt a rush of grief he'd tucked away. Kneeling, he brushed a few leaves aside. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, "I should have come sooner." Pup nudged David's hand. For a long moment he said nothing, letting regret and gratitude intermix. Finally he whispered, "This dog Pup wears a collar with your name on it. Different Lucas, but it still feels like a piece of you. I miss you, man." A breeze rustled the grass, carrying a sense of quiet acceptance. Pup licked David's cheek, as though offering comfort. David sniffed, wiping his eyes. Despite the swirl of unanswered questions, a faint sense of release stirred in his chest. Maybe Pup's arrival and the collar had led him here, to this moment of reckoning with the past. As weeks unfolded, Pup matured in both size and personality. His coat gleamed, his confidence soared, and his playful spirit charmed nearly everyone he met. David found himself more than just an accidental guardian. He was a bona fide dog owner. Now, buying chew toys, scheduling vet checkups, even considering obedience classes. Meanwhile, Marnie from the rail yard reached out about a small volunteer event aimed at spaying, neutering and vaccinating strays in a forgotten corner of the county. David decided to help on his own time, out of uniform. He drove Pup to the makeshift pop-up clinic set up behind an abandoned building. Canopies and folding tables dotted the area, and a dozen volunteers scurried about with leashes and pet carriers. When Marnie spotted David, she grinned. "Glad you're here. We could use an extra pair of hands." Pup wagged his tail as Marnie patted him. "Look at you," she cooed. "You've gotten so big." David spent the afternoon assisting in any way he could, distributing donated dog food, refilling water bowls, ushering anxious animals toward the mobile vet station. Pup, always sociable, served as an unofficial greeter. His calm presence seemed to reassure frightened dogs. During a lull, David struck up a conversation with another volunteer, an older man named Hector Ramirez, coincidentally the same Hector R. who had commented on David's social media post. They shared a laugh over the small world coincidence. "I knew Pup had to be the dog with the Lucas collar," Hector said, offering a handshake. "So, any luck finding that Nate guy?" David shook his head. "No real progress. Redwood Lake was a bust. I keep hearing rumors he's drifting from place to place." Hector nodded thoughtfully. "He might never stay long enough for you to catch up. But rumor also says he's distributing these collars because of someone named Lucas, someone he lost. Like a memorial, you know." David stared at Pup, remembering how that collar sparked an entire journey. "Yeah, that's what I keep hearing. Wish I could thank him for Pup, for everything." By day's end, the event had treated dozens of animals. Boxes of supplies were nearly exhausted. Marnie thanked David profusely, hugging Pup goodbye. In the golden light of late afternoon, David felt a remarkable sense of connection. He realized that Pup wasn't just his companion, he was a catalyst, uniting him with people who cared about the forgotten and abandoned. The old inscription on Pup's collar had grown into a unifying banner, even if its original meaning remained partly hidden. Driving home, Pup snoozed in the back seat. David caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, seeing a calmer, more open version of himself. Maybe this is the real point, he thought. Maybe it's not about solving a puzzle, but living a life that honors the message. Still, the flicker of curiosity never fully disappeared. A part of him wished for a face-to-face with Nate, to affirm Pup's journey and quell the gnawing sense of unfinished business. The user rumor mill, said Nate, had been spotted in the desert region next. David debated whether to chase that lead or let it go. Pup was healthy and safe. Perhaps that was closure enough. That night, as Pup nestled against David during a quiet moment on the sofa, David ran his thumb over the collar. "Never be afraid to come home." The words seemed less like a cryptic code and more like a gentle imperative to keep forging a home, to keep building a safe place for second chances. Pup's steady heartbeat offered the simplest truth. Love was often bigger than any single answer. Despite trying to let the matter rest, David couldn't suppress a fresh wave of curiosity when someone in the volunteer network mentioned they might spotted Nate at a rundown RV park on Highway 40. Weighing his remaining personal days, David decided to drive out on a Friday morning with Pup. The dusty highway cut through sun, scorched flats, and half-abandoned gas stations. A dry wind pummeled the car as tumbleweeds drifted lazily by. At the RV park's entrance, a creaking sign read Desert Oasis, though it looked anything but. Rusted trailers stood in neat rows, some with battered lawn chairs out front, others with laundry lines drooping in the heat. David parked, scanning for signs of life. Pup hopped down onto the baked dirt, nose twitching. An elderly man in a straw hat sat outside a beat-up trailer. David approached politely. "Pardon me, sir. I'm looking for a man named Nate Roswell. He might have passed through recently." The man squinted, adjusting his hat. "Yeah, there was a fella named Nate. Stayed a few days. Real nice guy. Had some dogs with him, or so I heard. He left last week, said he was heading to the next town. Something about helping strays." That familiar pang of near-miss frustration tightened David's chest. Did he say anything about a name Lucas's or mention dog collars with that word? The man shrugged. "Didn't mention that to me. Seemed to keep to himself. Always up before dawn, gone after dark." He left quietly. No fuss. Disappointed but not surprised, David nodded. "Thanks anyway." Walking back to his car, Pup panting beside him, David felt the edges of determination begin to crumble. He had chased half a dozen tips across the county, always arriving just after Nate's departure. Maybe Elaine was right, maybe Pup's story was already complete. Did David really need that final piece? Just as he was about to open the car door, a teenage boy ambled over from another trailer, curiosity lighting his eyes as he glanced at Pup. "That your dog?" he asked. David nodded. "Yeah." Found him wearing a collar that says, "Lucas, never be afraid to come home." The boy's face brightened. I saw that on the black lab Nate had. Told me he's dedicating these collars to his late brother who died in a car accident. Something about Lucas loving animals and wanting them to have safe homes. A chill ran down David's spine. His late brother, a car accident. This paralleled David's own friend, Lucas's end. The boy continued. Nate said every dog he saves carries that message, so Lucas's spirit lives on. He gets emotional talking about it. David swallowed hard. A swirl of sorrow, empathy, and resonance flooded him. So that was the reason for the repeating phrase, a tribute from one grieving brother to the memory of another. If Pup's collar originated from that heartbreak, it bound them in an invisible chain. He thanked the boy for the information and sat in the car for several long minutes before driving off. Pup lay his head on David's shoulder from the back seat, as if sensing the somber mood. The road stretched endless before them, shimmering with desert heat. David's thoughts turned to the friend he lost so many years ago under the same tragic circumstances. Nate's brother was named Lucas too. It felt surreal, two men linked by the same name and heartbreak. Perhaps the greatest tribute David could offer was to keep Pup safe and loved, living out the dream that both Lucases once held in their hearts. By the time he returned to Riverside County, the sun was low, painting the sky with a haze of orange and purple. The tension he'd harbored for weeks settled into a bittersweet understanding. He might never meet Nate, but the collar's meaning was clear. It was a banner of grief turned into compassion. In the days that followed, David found a new sense of peace. Each morning, he walked Pup around the neighborhood, greeting folks who had watched the puppy grow from a trembling stray into a confident companion. Even at the police station, Pup had become something of a mascot. Officers joked about awarding him an honorary badge. One afternoon, Marnie phoned David with an invitation. We're hosting a bigger outreach event next month. Adoptions, free vaccines, dog training demos. It'll be at the old community center. Could you help us set up? Maybe bring Pup. He's such a great example of a rescue success. David agreed without hesitation. For the first time, he recognized that Pup and the collar's message had given him a calling outside of routine policing. He wanted to help other animals find homes, to encourage more compassion in a world where strays were often cast aside. At home, David leafed through a new adoption flyer pinned to his fridge. He thought about his old regrets over Lucas Harrington and how Pup's collar sparked a chance to turn guilt into something constructive. If Lucas were here, David thought, he'd push me to do exactly this, expand kindness wherever possible. That evening, after finishing a late patrol, David settled with Pup on the couch. The dog stretched contentedly, muzzle resting on David's thigh. The collar still bore scuffs, and the lettering was more faded from Pup's everyday adventures, but the words remained visible. Lucas, never be afraid to come home. David no longer bristled with questions at the sight. Instead, he felt a deep appreciation for the journey that had led them here. The knowledge that Nate was somewhere out there, continuing to honor his brother's memory through these collars, warmed David's heart. They were two men linked by a name and a lost loved one, channeled into saving dogs that needed a safe place. Rain tapped gently on the window, a mild spring shower reminiscent of the storm that first brought Pup into David's arms. He recalled that frantic night on Maple Avenue, how the puppy's whimpers cut through the roar of rain, how his own heart had seized with worry. Now Pup was snoring softly, secure in the knowledge he had a home. David's chest tightened with gratitude. It struck him that home was more than four walls. It was the sense of acceptance and belonging they both found. Whether Pup's collar was originally a tribute to Nate's Lucas or not, it had become a bridge, linking strangers who believed in second chances. The next step, David realized, was spreading that spirit further. He grabbed his laptop and opened a fresh document, drafting a proposal for a community outreach program run by local law enforcement in conjunction with the volunteer rescue groups. The goal: reduce the stray population humanely, support low-cost vet clinics, and organize adoption drives. He typed with a passion that surprised him. Pup occasionally flicked an ear at the keyboard noise, but drifted back to sleep. David didn't know if the department would approve the initiative, but he felt compelled to try. Something about Pup's collar demanded more than acceptance. It asked him to share what he'd learned, that we all need a place to be unafraid, a place to belong. The community adoption fair at Riverside's Old Center was a bustling success. Colorful banners draped across the entrance, music played through portable speakers, and volunteers milled about, guiding prospective adopters to meet dogs, cats, and even a few rabbits. David arrived early with Pup, helping Marnie and Hector set up kennels, arrange donation tables, and greet the public. Pup's natural charisma worked wonders. Families and passers-by who were just browsing soon found themselves enamored by the affectionate dogs on display. Several found new forever homes that day. Watching wagging tails depart with excited new owners made David's heart feel lighter than it had in years. During a quiet moment, Elaine showed up, off-duty, bringing donated blankets. She winked at David, acknowledging the transformation she saw in him. He explained the new rescue partnership he was drafting, how Pup's story had inspired him to pitch a program that merged policing with compassionate animal care. Elaine smiled warmly. "I'd say Pup rescued you, too." Mid-afternoon, after a rush of adoptions, David and Pup took a breather under a shady oak. Pup dozed at his feet, the worn collar partially hidden by his thickening fur. David watched children squeal as they petted newly adopted puppies, volunteers exchanging high fives, and older dogs happily wagging at the promise of a second chance. "This is Lucas's dream in action," he thought, mind flickering to both Lucas's his friend and Nate's brother. He remembered how once he'd chased after the collar's origin in hopes of meeting Nate. Part of him still wished for that direct encounter, to share how Pup had changed his life. But he also recognized the collar's message had already done its work, bridging heartbreak and forging hope. Nate's traveling rescue might remain elusive, yet the kindness it spread was undeniable, forging new paths wherever it touched. The event wound down near sunset. Adopters left with excited animals, arms full of supplies, and hearts brimming with possibility. Marnie and Hector beamed at the day's success. David lingered to help tear down tables, Pup trotting beside him. As the final box was loaded into the rescue van, Marnie approached, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "You did good, Morales. I'm glad Pup found you that night." Her gaze flicked to Pup's collar. "That inscription has turned out to be a guiding light for a lot of us." David nodded, emotion stirring. "It sure has. I guess we all want to believe in a world where no one's afraid to come back home." Later, as the last rays of sun bled into a warm, rust-colored sky, David and Pup headed to his car. Pup hopped in, immediately curling into the passenger seat with a satisfied yawn. David sat behind the wheel, taking a moment to absorb the day's events. The adoption fair, the new faces, and the steady beating of Pup's unwavering trust formed a powerful collage in his mind. He gently touched the collar, reading the inscription one more time, "Lucas, never be afraid to come home." He thought of his own regrets, the friend he lost, the illusions of a second chance he never had. Yet Pup had given him a second chance in a different way, an opportunity to build a home free from fear, brimming with compassion. Starting the engine, David glanced at Pup's trusting eyes. "All right, buddy," he murmured, "let's head home." As they pulled away from the center, the final glow of daylight illuminated Pup's collar, a quiet testament to a journey that began in a rainstorm but led them both into the warmth of belonging. A single rescue during a thunderous storm led Officer David Morales down a path he never expected, one woven from heartbreak, hope, and second chances. What began with a puppy's desperate dash in the rain sparked a network of connections, from hidden rail yards to desert RV parks, revealing a poignant truth. The collar's inscription honored someone named Lucas, turning one family's loss into a lifeline for forgotten dogs. In the process, David confronted his own guilt and grief, learning that never be afraid to come home was more than a phrase. It was an open invitation to heal, to give love, and to receive it without fear. If this story of resilience and renewal touched your heart, share it with friends who need a reminder that compassion can bloom from life's darkest storms. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more uplifting stories. Let's keep building homes where no one is afraid to return.